Industrialism and the rise of the United States to world prominence. Industrialism, that is, the United States becoming a world industrial power. In the first century of its existence, the United States was primarily an agricultural nation. Most American men were farmers. Most American women were married to American farmers. They were farm wives. That is not industrialism, folks. That's agriculture. The growing of wheat and corn and pigs and cattle, milk, whatever. Agriculture. It's not the making of washing machines and cars and radios and cell phones and all that stuff. That's industrialism. But in the 1790s, the very first decade of our existence as a nation, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, that is the man in charge of the money, and also one of the most important founding fathers, had a vision for a future America that was not an agricultural nation. He wanted the United States to become a great commercial and industrial power, one of the great powers of the world. Thomas Jefferson, who was Washington's Secretary of State, that's the man in charge of foreign policy, had a quite opposite vision for America. Perhaps most of you know that Thomas Jefferson was a great plantation owner, agriculture, right? And of course, slaves, because he was from Virginia, southern state. And Jefferson's vision for America was not commercial and industrial, it was agricultural. He thought America needed to stay an agricultural nation for its endurance so as to preserve its Republican simplicity and freedom and equality. Because Jefferson believed that if American farmers were the mainstay, the primary mode of living in America, see, farmers were largely self-reliant and independent. Nobody told a farmer how much corn to plant or such. But if Americans became workers in factories, Hamilton's vision, an industrial nation, then the bosses of those factories and the owners of those factories could tell the majority of the American men what to do, how to vote, and so forth. And by the way, they will, and they did. So it wasn't just about whether we should be farmers or whether we should own factories and be workers. It was about whether a republic could be a republic, a free democracy with a commercial background. Jefferson said, no, you will not be free men. Hamilton said, yes, you can be. In fact, Hamilton was equally convincing. He said, unless we become that, how will we defend ourselves? The British, the French, the Spanish, they will not be impressed if we line up and throw corn at them when they come here for us. You see? Only weapons will stop them. Only industry will stop them. So in a dangerous world, we had to be an industrial power. Now, if you can't say that one man or the other was right, well, welcome to the real world. They both have a good point, don't they? Yeah, that's what it means to be an American. We go around in a constant state of confusion. Just kidding. Told you about bad jokes, right? That wasn't the one I was talking about. I just want you to see how complicated the world really is. And so the rise of industrialization in America will bring this question to a point. Industrialism made Americans less equal than Jefferson had imagined they should be or wanted them to be. Some businessmen now, in creating these factories, became fabulously wealthy. But the people they hired to work in their factories generally got paid less than what American farmers were making on the farm. And so we have a tremendous rise in inequality in terms of wealth in America because of industrialism. Some are extraordinarily wealthy. Many are less well off than even the farmers were. Big gap. Does this matter today? Does one party today tell the American people that the gap between the haves and the have-nots is too wide? Absolutely. It's front and center of the campaign. Ironically, the other party said the same thing in 2016, only they had different solutions to the problem. President Trump in 2016 appealed to those Americans who felt left behind by the economy, that they weren't doing that well. You see, they voted for him, for a change. In places like Ohio, Pennsylvania, places that traditionally had voted the other way. And so Trump was elected. Again, complicated, but relevant. So we have new questions regarding what America should be at the end of the 19th century because of the rise of industrialism. Is it appropriate to try to narrow the gap between the rich and the poor? That was the first time this question was asked, and is still being asked 100 years ago. The theme of the lecture, the Industrial Revolution shaped the social, political, and intellectual life of the American people to the degree that at the end of the 19th century, the United States had been transformed. It happens in the 1800s, the 19th century. It had been transformed from Thomas Jefferson's agricultural republic, that's the way it was in 1800, to Alexander Hamilton's industrial republic, that's what defined us in 1900. I can see Thomas Jefferson rolling in his grave. And Alexander Hamilton rising up and doing a toe tap. Right? I was right. For that reason, the industrialization and urbanization, that is, the creation of great cities where the factories are and the workers are, of the United States stands amongst the most important developments in American history. We are who we are because of this. Not only does it stand as one of the great developments in our nation's history, it stands as one of the most important developments in world history because had it not been for this, there would have been no American Allied victory in the Second World War. Because we needed the factories. The Germans and the Japanese would not have been impressed by corn. Okay. That's reality. Well, this development, the rise of industrialization, had a tremendous impact on the ideas of freedom and equality. What does it mean to be free? What does it mean to be equal? Is there an economic aspect to this question? You see, our founding fathers did not think so. This is absolutely crucial now. Founding fathers defined freedom and equality as pertaining to two areas in American life. One was politics. Basically, you're free and equal if you have one man, one vote. Right? Free and equal. That was their definition of freedom and equality regarding politics. One man, one vote. And they did mean men. And then the other aspect of it was judicial. That is, in case you're accused of a crime, you have rights. You're to be treated free and equal. And that is, you have the right to be tried by a jury of your peers. Peers meaning men and women like you. Not a trial by aristocrats, the upper class, if you're a lower class man, but a trial of people like you. Free and equal. Political, judicial. That's it. There's no social equality in terms of the Founding Fathers. There's no economic equality. It's not one of their concerns in terms of the Founding Fathers. There's no other kind of equality or freedom. That's it. And then, of course, it only applied to white men, too. So industrialism is going to raise the question, is there an economic aspect to the idea of freedom and equality? And if so, what's the solution? Because the times have changed. We are now an industrial nation. So we have a new question. And we're going to have answers that the Founding Fathers never even dreamed of, because they never dreamed, except for Alexander Hamilton, of the change. You see? The transition period from 1876 to 1890. 15 years. Wow. Fast. In 1876, the United States celebrated its first century of independence, 1776 to 1876. It's a centennial. Appropriately, the nation held a huge fair in Philadelphia, the city of our birth. On display were numerous American-made industrial machines. We are well into the Industrial Revolution. We're celebrating America. Look at all the machines and all the things we have produced. It's a World's Fair type thing. Now, on one table in a corner of one of the great halls that housed these machines was a very small box. Hardly one of the great machines of the day. And around this very small box had clustered a large group of teenage girls. In fact, there were so many teenage girls there that you could not get close to this little box on the table. Of course, I'm talking about, some of you already know, this is the bad joke I was talking about. Alexander Graham Bell's telephone. Now, 25 years ago or more, when I first told that joke, it was more funny. And it was more personal. Because I was going through those moments as a father of two teenage girls in which the phone on the wall in my living room seemed to ring incessantly. Oh, swear word, that box. I was so unhappy about being interrupted as I watched reruns of Gunsmoke that I went to the extravagant extent of putting a phone upstairs where the recipients of those calls were always living anyway. And then I told them, I ain't answering it. If it rings, it's up to you. Now, this is well before the invention of cell phones, which is why my joke isn't so funny anymore. Because obviously that solved the entire problem. So, yes, Bell's telephone was there, though. I'm not exaggerating or kidding about that. It's one of the inventions. Change is coming. As I like to say, the only thing that never changes is change. It's always coming. You can count on it. In 1876, the United States is gradually being defined by its inventions, its machines, those things that will contribute to industrialism. Within 2 decades, a nation of small property owners, usually farmers, became a nation in which most men worked for other men in factories. By the end of the century, by 1900. Imagine that. Technology is transforming the farm. You don't need as many farm hands now. Where are they going to work? Factories in the cities. That's what's happening. And many new kinds of industries are being created. The triumph of industrialism. The distinguishing features of the American Industrial Revolution were its astonishing success. Do you know there are nations in the world today that have been trying to industrialize for generations? And they can't seem to get there. Astonishing success. We take it for granted. We so take for granted the astonishing success of our material prosperity that we consider all kinds of things that may, in fact, decrease our material prosperity. Because it's always been there, right? You can lose it. The second distinguishing feature was how fast it occurred. Again, that's astonishing. Within that 15 years, we have accomplished it. By 1890, we are the world's greatest industrial power. And here's the kicker. A lot of industrial powers, in fact, the leading industrial power of the 19th century was not the United States until the very end, as I've said. It was Great Britain. Great Britain was the leader. But the British found as they became more and more industrialized, they could not feed themselves. They had to import corn and wheat and all kinds of things. They couldn't feed themselves. Oh, not in America. No, we become defined by our industry by 1890, by the end of the century, because our industrial capacity grew so fast that it overtook our agricultural capacity. But our agricultural capacity grew as well. That's the astonishing fact. We become this great industrial power. We can still feed ourselves and ship food overseas because our agricultural growth also grew. It just got passed up. It's like the agriculture was a fast man, but the industrial part was the fastest man in the world. The best of both worlds. Americans. And yet we take it for granted. So, the degree of this success, one of the factors, and then just how fast it took place is the other, yes. Absolutely, absolutely. But in case you think that that is the full explanation, take Russia / the Soviet Union, late 19th century and then well into the 20th century. The natural resources of the Soviet Union dwarf those of the United States. In terms of oil and minerals and agricultural land and so forth, it just dwarfs the United States. And yet, at the end of the Soviet experiment in communism, we're talking about a country that's bankrupt, that cannot feed itself. You see? Hence the end of the Soviet Union in 1989. And the end of the Soviet Empire in 1989, and the Soviet Union in 1991. So that's not the only answer. There's something about the way the Americans approached this, you see, that maximizes, or close to maximizes, their natural resources. Now, of course, with the increase of factories in the cities, the rise of industrialization, as many of the sons of farmers and even some of the daughters of farmers left the farm and went to the cities to take those jobs, some of the farmers themselves. So the cities are doubling in population in the 1880s. Yes, doubling in population. The other factor, of course, is immigration. This is the period of Ellis Island and so forth of massive immigration into the United States. So the cities are growing with immigrants as well. Indeed, the cities and industry is growing so fast that in the 1880s, more miles of railroad track are laid in the United States than in any other decade of our history. And we are a long ways away from cars and trucks. Okay, long ways away. The 1880s and the increase of railroad mileage in order to move the goods. The growth of American railroads had a profound effect on the world economy because now goods from the heartland, in addition to being sent down the rivers, which is relatively slow, can be sent across the country to the ports and then loaded onto the ships and sent across the world at relatively inexpensive rates. So American grain, American goods are being sent all over the world by the end of the 19th century. The key to the Industrial Revolution is power. Fortunately, we no longer argue about power in America today. No one's worried about fossil fuels, coal, right? Yeah. Absolutely, it's huge. Yeah. One party today wants to maximize whatever power we can lay our hands on. Okay? And the other party is very concerned about some forms of power and its damage to the environment. You need to figure that out. Which party do you agree with? You need to figure that out before you vote. You see how careful I'm trying to be here. I'm not even telling you which party's which. Go figure it out. I don't care how you vote, just know what you're voting for. Sometimes I won't be quite so oblique or obtuse. Power. Well, the power in the 19th century came from steam engines. And you can create steam by burning something. It can be wood can burn, right? But more efficient back then was burning coal. And nobody worried about whether it was dirty or clean. All right? Wasn't the problem. At least not for those people. They just wanted efficient power. So the key to the Industrial Revolution was power. The power comes from steam engines. And steam engines, properly harnessed, can do just about anything. Those are steam engines on the old trains. Those are steam engines running the factory machines and so forth. Okay? Steam engines. And most of them burn coal. Is America blessed with coal? Probably to the extent that we will give up using coal for the reasons aforementioned before we ever run out today. Problems with industrialism and some solutions. Nothing in life is ever without problems. I have been emphasizing good here, the increase of American ability to produce goods, the rise of a standard of living, the increase of prosperity. These are all good things, in my mind. But there are negatives as well. Sadly, in most American universities and colleges, giving this lecture, it's all about the negative. It shouldn't be. Life is more complex than that. I've already given you one of the great positives of the Industrial Revolution. We're not speaking German. The Man in the High Castle is fiction. Right? So don't forget that. But there are problems. Let's face those problems. For many American industrialists, the goal now was to create a monopoly of their industry. You want to organize your business to eliminate competition so that there's nobody else building what you're building. And the American people have to come to you to buy what you want to sell, and so you get to name the price. We call this monopoly. We even made a board game out of it. I have an undefeated record in Monopoly. When I win, I flip up the board, and I make the rest of my family angry at me for days. I'm kidding. But is that not the attitude? Right? John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, the robber barons of steel and oil. Yeah, monopoly. Monopolies then, at this time, the end of the 19th century, arise in many industries. Railroads, for example. Imagine if you're a farmer out there in the wheat fields of Minnesota. Thank you. Charles Ingalls. Little House fans? How many of you read Little House books when you were little? Yeah. My daughter read them all. Charles Ingalls is out there on the Little House on the Prairie, and he's got a wheat farm, and he's got the crop in, and now he's trying to get it sent to St. Paul, but there's only one railroad. And they're going to charge him whatever they want to get that wheat crop to market. And Charles is going to be left with hardly enough to buy shoes for Mary and Halfpine. Okay? Because they got a monopoly, folks. That's monopoly in America. Is that right? Is that fair? So all of these great industrialists are trying to create a monopoly in which they control the prices that they get, the wages that they pay. There are no wage laws in America. There's no minimum wage. Solutions. Americans thought it was not right, that something should be done about that. So they naturally turned to government to pass laws to address the problem of, at first, railroad rates. That was the most obvious one. It affected more Americans, right? Because still a lot of farmers out there. A lot of business people trying to ship their produce and stuff, and products. And so they created the Interstate Commerce Commission, federal commission, to regulate, not hard here, regulate rates. The railroads, even if they're monopolies, even if they're dominated by one railroad, they can only charge so much to send so much corn or whatever from one place to another. That's the purpose of the Interstate Commerce Commission, to regulate railroad rates. Doesn't sound like a big deal, but look at the enormous step here. We're going to use the federal government to try to make America more fair. Now, it doesn't work perfectly. Here's another lesson to learn. You pass a law, you solve the problem. This is not the way life is, folks. If only it were that easy. Well, then the great industrialists got their lawyers together and they decided, well, this is how we can get around this law. See? They even bribed people, commissioners, to look the other way. So it's a step towards regulation, but it's not perfect. A few years later, in 1890, the American people thought, well, maybe we just need to make all monopolies illegal. You can't do that. And so the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was passed. I know it doesn't exactly sound like it's an anti-monopoly act, but if you just cross out that word trust and put anti-monopoly in there, you got it. The Sherman Anti-Monopoly Act. That's the idea, okay? A trust is a form of monopolies. And the idea was then that you could use the courts to bring a lawsuit against a monopoly, and then the courts would issue an injunction, a ruling saying you can't do that, and then that monopoly would have to sell off the parts of its business that made it monopoly, and you wouldn't have a monopoly anymore. That's the idea behind it. But again, we all know how this is going to work out, don't we? Human beings are involved, so it's not perfect. It doesn't work exactly the way it was intended. And the presidents of the United States, both Democrat and Republican, didn't really like the law in the 1890s. And because they didn't like it, they didn't enforce it. Okay? In spite of their constitutional oath. Yeah. There you go. So, step in the right direction if you favor this kind of thing, but not entirely successful. So one of the causes of industrialism, one of the results of industrialism is monopoly, and then there's an attempt to deal with monopoly by the part of the government. Another impact of the Industrial Revolution was low-paying jobs. Again, there's no minimum wage, folks. You have a job, you put the job up there, and you're paying enough that you attract people who want the job, period. It's up to you. So now in the factory system, you're going to have a lot of really low-paying jobs. Why? Because America's population is growing by leaps and bounds. You've got the sons of farmers that need work. You've got the daughters of farmers that need work. You've got immigration by the millions of people that need work. So you've got a lot of low-paying factory jobs here, folks, which is just the way the great industrial tycoons wanted it. It's not exactly open borders, but there is massive immigration. And the people that wanted it that way, in addition to the immigrants, are the people that own the businesses. In fact, the business people so wanted to have so many people in the cities who were willing to work for almost anything that they sent recruiters to Europe. Come to America. The streets are paved with gold. Get on the ship, go to America, go all the way to Chicago. That's where my meatpacking plant is. That's where the jobs are great. So they came. They're coming to America. Right? This goes on for decades. The streets are not paved with gold, they're paved with coal soot. And in spite of what looks like to be a conspiracy to keep wages low, the amazing thing is that life was so much better in America for the vast majority, not everybody, but for the vast majority, they kept coming. How bad were things in Europe that they would keep coming? You've got to remember to compare to the way other things are in other places, or you can't understand America. So business owners and recruiters were trying to keep those wages low. They wanted the immigrants to keep coming. Imagine how profitable a business can be if they pay whatever they want, if they can charge whatever they want because they're a monopoly, right? Well, how do workers then finally respond to this? They begin to organize themselves into what? Labor unions. And then finally decide to take their labor unions out on strike. But if you're a labor union of unskilled workers, how much clout do you have? Virtually none. Virtually none. Not when there's so many people, unskilled people, waiting to take those jobs. Okay? Now, if you're a skilled worker, that is, you know how to do something, right? You got more clout. And so the labor unions that arose that were somewhat successful were unions of skilled workers. But they left the unskilled behind. In 1877, in the middle of this period, there was a great strike. They called it that, the Great Strike, in which railroad workers and other transportation workers walked off their jobs. They won higher wages. And then the strike spreads to other industries, the miners, the steel workers. Hence the Great Strike. America seems to be on strike. But it's not successful. There's violence all across America. Lives are lost. People die in strikes, especially in this era and well into the 20th century. The Great Strike was broken back to the way it used to be. Unsuccessful. Many Americans came to realize that the existence of political freedom, as the Founding Fathers defined it, did not guarantee that men would have social justice, did not guarantee that men would have an equal opportunity to succeed in America. See? Many Americans come to believe that political and judicial freedom was not enough. You needed to have some element of economic freedom as well, social justice. Strikes and the evolution of the labor union now became standard aspect of American society in the late 19th century. The American Federation of Labor, the AFL, was led by Samuel Gompers. He's the organizer, or one of the chief organizers of the AFL. And this is one of those skilled unions. It's organized in 1886 to achieve better wages and safer working conditions. Again, there's no minimum wage laws, and there are no federal regulations as to safety or anything like that. In some states, in some cities, you have some regulation, but not at the federal level. So labor unions and new laws were two of the methods the American people adopted to meet the new problems associated with industrialism. In other words, these movements were attempts to make the average American more free, more equal, to provide greater economic opportunity. So Americans were beginning to think that freedom and equality might have an economic aspect to it as well as political and judicial. This is the beginning then of a major change in America. A change that shapes the 20th century It begins right there at the end of the 19th with the ICC, Interstate Commerce Commission, and the Sherman Antitrust Act, but then it's going to carry forward into the 20th century, and this is going to define American domestic politics in the 20th century. Indeed, to this day. Economic fairness. Economic fairness. There are other responses to industrialism. Yeah, it's such a huge thing. Many white, educated, middle-class Americans became concerned over the conditions in the cities that industrialization had created. Imagine a major city, even today, doubling in population in 10 years. Portland is not ready for that. No American city is ready for that, even today. Back then, they were even less ready. And so you're going to have people everywhere in all kinds of squalid, dirty kinds of conditions. One of the most important of these leaders in this response was Jane Addams. Jane Addams, double D there. Jane Addams is one of the great ladies in American history. She saw a problem. She said, I'm going to help fix that problem. And Addams does not work for the federal government. She's an American. She's a Christian. She's motivated by her Christianity and her love for her fellow human beings to do something about the squalor, the poverty of the cities, especially amongst immigrants who've gotten off the train or off the ship, and they're still at sea, essentially. And so she created what she called settlement houses. She started in Chicago. And so she got some wealthy business people who were also humanitarians to fund what she called the settlement house, which is a big house in Chicago in the area of poverty and the slums and so forth. And in this settlement house that she started, she offered help to the immigrants of Chicago. You don't speak the language, we'll help you with English. You don't understand this money in America? Well, we'll help you not get cheated by the local grocer, right? You need daycare. You need to know how to take care of that newborn that your mother is no longer here. She's back in the old country, and here you are. You've got a brand new newborn. You don't know. We'll help you. We'll help you learn to sew. We'll help you find jobs. We'll help you. We'll help you. We'll help you. The settlement house. Jane Addams. Eventually, she took settlement houses to all major American cities. And in so doing, again, this is volunteer, okay? She became the founder of the modern social work profession. If you're a sociology major or in social work, you know who Jane Addams was. In fact, all Americans ought to know who Jane Addams was. There were spiritual responses to industrialism as well. The Salvation Army was created in London in 1860 by William Booth, who was a Methodist minister. London is the first great city to go into industrialization, and so Booth's Salvation Army is there in London. It starts there. He's trying to bring the gospel and help to London's poor. He cared about the poor. He's a Christian. He knows what Jesus said, hence my scriptures this morning. Right? The gospel to all nations, regardless of economic income, regardless of gender or race. In 1880, Booth came to New York City with the Salvation Army. Yeah. Same deal. Gospel, help. Gospel help. Spiritual response. And then there's an enormously important philosophical response to industrialism. If it hadn't been for industrialism, you would never have heard of the name Karl Marx. Marx doesn't come from out of the blue with just ideas regarding communism. He looks around him, specifically London, at the situation created by industrialism, and he says this is not right. This is so unequal, this is so unfair, this is so immoral. There must be some adjustment to this coming. Karl Marx. So industrialism creates Karl Marx. So Adam Smith, the great English economist and father of capitalism, and Karl Marx, the father of communism, are like in this cosmic battle with one another. They're joined at the hip. Marx does not exist without Smith. Marxism is more than an economic theory, it's an historical theory too. It becomes a religion as well. Marx argues that the proletariat, here's where your French comes in. It means the workers in the factories, okay? Proletariat, you have to know this now because it still matters. Marx argues that the proletariat is going to rise up someday. It's prophecy, see? It's going to happen. They are going to rise up and they are going to, in a revolution, they're going to throw off the shackles of the owners and their managers, the so-called bourgeoisie. Again, French. So the owners and their managers of the bourgeoisie, they are the oppressors of the proletariat. And someday the proletariat, the workers, are just going to get so frustrated, they're going to rise up in revolution. They are going to sweep away the bourgeoisie and create a workers' state. That's communism, folks. And in the workers' state, everybody's going to be what? Equal. Equal. Equal in every way. Politically, judicially, economically, socially, everybody's equal. The complete opposite of capitalism. Now, this happens throughout the 20th century, right? In the Soviet Union, in Russia, in 1917, you have a revolution, and eventually the Bolsheviks, that is the communists, take over. That's why you have a Soviet Union, folks. It's communist. That's why in 1949 you'll have a communist China. That's why you'll have a communist North Korea and a communist Vietnam. Karl Marx. You could argue, let's say 500 years from now, you get one sentence to describe the 20th century in your history text. One sentence for the 20th century. The conflict between communism and capitalism, the Soviet Union, and the United States. And at the end of the 20th century, the United States had emerged victorious. Move on to the 21st century. Okay? There you go. It's not all you need to know because you live in the early 21st century. But 500 years from now, that'd probably be it. See? That's how important this is. The facts. There's no economically successful communist state, folks. In the 20th century and in the 21st century, there's no economically successful communist state, period. Hasn't happened yet. The communist experiments all ended in failure, and they did not create equality either, because what happens is you get an elite at the top, the Communist Party, and they don't live like the rest of the people. It's human nature. And then you have more equality in the lower echelons, but it's an equality of poverty. This is why the Soviet Union falls. And so history is telling us that communism doesn't work to this point. Does that mean that all communists have given up and said, hey, history has taught us this doesn't work? No, it's not the way human beings think. And so the communists out there today will tell you that it just hasn't been tried correctly yet. That's what they say. We need to try it right. Some of them live here in the United States and would very much like to try it here. See, you got to make your own call here, folks. In America, Henry George wrote a political response to industrialism called Progress and Poverty in 1879. So here we are. An American, Henry George, writes a political response to industrialism. He also sees that there are problems with industrialism that we should address. Henry George. George argued poverty need not accompany progress. You can have economic progress. You can have economic industrialism. You can have that in a democratic capitalist society like ours. It doesn't have to lead to poverty. George said that this poverty that we have is a product of an unjust society. We can fix it within our democratic capitalistic system. We can keep our system and fix the poverty. Marx was saying, just throw everything out and start over again. And George is saying, no, keep the good, let's fix it. And then other Americans were saying that they're both wrong. Obviously, Karl Marx is wrong. But even George was wrong. You had to keep absolutely free capitalism. No laws, no restrictions, no nothing, just capitalism. That's the extreme right. Marx is the extreme left. George is somewhere in the middle. Okay? And all of us fall somewhere on this massive continuum of political ideology. Karl Marx, way left. Extreme right, no laws whatsoever. Let the best man win. Okay? In the business game. Monopoly. In other words, if that were to prevail, we would all work for Amazon at some point. Okay? Because Jeff Bezos is already the second richest man in the world. So, George is saying, we can do something about it. We can do something about the conditions industrialization has created in the factories and in the cities and even on the farms. And so Americans who read George and agreed with George, they began to look towards government as the agent by which reform could most assuredly be effected. What was big enough to deal with these problems? They could only think of one thing. Only the federal government was big enough to deal with these problems. In so doing, they eventually and fundamentally changed the nature of that federal government in the United States. In my lecture in a couple weeks on what we call progressivism, which is a political movement in response to industrialism, I will explain this progressive response to industrialism. We've already seen how the Interstate Commerce Commission was a start and how the Sherman Trust Act was a start. But the progressives of the early 20th century are going to go further, okay? Using the federal government to address these problems. All right, God bless you all. See you next time.